Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show today, bringing you another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow. Today, we are joined on the show by Dr. Courtney Millar. She is an assistant scientist at the Hinda and Arthur Marcus Institute for Aging Research, Hebrew Senior Life, as well as instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And she's a research scientist that's devoted to improving health and well-being of older adults through the study of dietary interventions. And her current research ultimately aims to study the ability of various anti-inflammatory dietary strategies to promote both physical and emotional well-being in older adults. Dr. Millar received a PhD in molecular nutrition, University of Connecticut. There, she developed a really interesting understanding of the relationship between dietary bioactive compounds and metabolic disease. She went on to do a postdoc focused on ultimately training related to how one conducts these really interesting and sort of combinatorial, multifaceted nutritional epidemiological analyses, as well as the clinical interventions. And as you know, we have profiled in the past, the Hinda and Arthur Marcus Institute for Aging Research is broadly focused on finding solutions to pressing challenges related to aging, including areas like Alzheimer's, dementia, osteoporosis, frailty, as a variety of other areas. Honored to have her with us. Really looking forward to the discussion. Dr. Courtney Millar, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Great having you. Really great having you. I love these topics, and I really look forward to the discussion. I think I'd like to start off like we typically do, sort of at the beginning when you were doing your dissertation, and I looked at it, the effect of plant, animal, and micro-derived bioactive compounds on atherosclerosis. I love this theme. And you point out in your work that we got some drugs, but we forget about diet, not just in terms of, basic nutrition, but of all the really interesting bioactive compounds that have basic beyond nutritional value. And I think in your paper, you study three. You study something from the plant kingdom in terms of elderberry extract. You study these really interesting lipids from eggs, and then something known as lipid 654 from microbes, which I'll know we'll be talking about in a little bit when we get into the microbiome. Talk a little about your dissertation, sort of why you picked this topic, and a little bit of what you found, because it's really interesting that these three unique substances or sets of substances did three really interesting things that were different from one another.
Yeah, so I guess I'll even start a little bit before grad school, as I was in doing my graduate or undergrad at Marist College and studying biology. And during that time, I was kind of plagued with this question: what do I want to do with my life? And I was really trying to decide between becoming a medical doctor or, doing research. And I really liked the idea of both. I liked that both aspects were ultimately trying to help people. I really didn't like physics. And so I did physics one and was just like, you know what, this requirement for med school, it's not for me. And that was maybe a serendipitous way for me to get more involved in research. And it really kind of got at my desire to be more curious and understand why things happen. So I took a course in vertebrate physiology where I learned about how these the macronutrients like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins get broken down in the body, and how it actually is related to diabetes and type 2 diabetes in that onset. And that was such a nice example of how nutrition is so pivotal and critical for the development of diseases and or maintaining health, really. And that's when I know, okay, I want to study more about that. I want to know, how do these nutrients, foods that we eat on a daily basis, how can we leverage them and use them to help with diseases? So I found some research by Dr. Blesso at the University of Connecticut, and he was studying these really interesting compounds called flavonoids and
Mhm.
polyphenols, and how they're contained within berries and how they might relate to heart disease and atherosclerosis, which is like the buildup of plaque and the hardening of arteries. And so it was a really cool way for me to start investigating that question. So we did a few studies on with mice. So that's where we started, or that's where I started at least, is utilizing mice as a platform to see how these dietary compounds found in berries might be able to protect against heart disease and
Mhm.
atherosclerosis. So I was doing that work, and I kind of found my niche where I was the only one in the lab who knew how to do this really intricate athero development.
Okay.
And so as I was going through, I was trying to figure out what my entire dissertation was going to be. And, it just kind of came about that there was a molecule that they were studying found in eggs and milk called sphingomyelin.
Mhm.
And so that was something that we looked at um, with heart disease. And we hadn't looked at it with heart disease before. And we found some really interesting effects related to the gut microbiota and how it can be, it might be protective against heart disease in mice. And then came the bacterial lipid work, which again was like kind of just utilizing my strengths of this athero method. But I think overall it came into a really nice story of these different types of compounds, whether they're from the diet or they're increased by dietary compounds through the gut microbiota and how they impact health.
Mhm.
Sorry,
Yeah,
that was a really long-winded
no,
answer.
no. I love answers like that, and again, we're dealing with a major killer still in 2025, and the fact, again, not just. I think we don't give, let's say, the natural world, and whether it's the bacteria, the plants, or some of the other species out there, enough credit for sort of the interesting chemistries that they can ultimately produce, as you showed in your paper, to stabilize aortic root plaque and HDL and levels and all that. So it was very impressive. One thing before we get further into your work, I would just love we could just talk for a couple of minutes about just the theme of molecular nutrition, because you Google it and it tells you, okay, here, this is the study of the molecular mechanisms by how nutrients, and you were just saying, impact things at the cellular and biochemical level. I always thought about, we're sitting here coming out of the pharma industry in the past, but having spent some time in the world of sort of nutrition, that okay, pharma, we create these things that have mechanisms like this anti-tumor necrosis antibody for inflammation. These blueberries over here are also great for inflammation, but that's a mode. Um, you bring them together with molecular nutrition. That, hey, beyond, okay, these blueberries are anti-inflammatory, we know now why. And it's always amazing the very interesting mechanisms that pop up, and we'll be getting into that as we go further into discussion. Introduce us just in general to this theme of molecular nutrition and how you think about what you are, molecular nutritionist.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that when I first would introduce myself, and still even to this day, I'll say I study nutrition, and people will say, "Oh, great. How much, vitamin A am I supposed to be eating?" And I have to say, I really don't know. That is not my area of expertise. I am not going to be able to tell you that. Dietitians are wonderful and they have an amazing line of work, and that's what they do. But what I really do is I thoughtfully think about the food matrix.
Yep.
What are in these foods? How are these, blueberries are a vessel, yes, for maybe um, antioxidants like polyphenols, but they're not just that. There's a matrix of different food components, and trying to understand the theoretical benefit of all those different compounds within a food, but also how they relate and how they, you know, affect complex processes and might synergistically impact something.
Hmm.
At the same time, a nutrient in a food might help a certain physiological pathway, but at the same time, another might actually, reduce it. And
Hmm.
so I think trying to get a holistic representation of what is in the foods at a very molecular level and how it could impact physiology once we eat them is really kind of the crux of what I'd like to do.
Awesome. Awesome. And, as mentioned, following your PhD, you went on to do postdoc work and focusing on not just, administering these substances and so forth, but thinking about, when we're doing an epidemiological study or a clinical intervention, this isn't, traditional drug development where you take this pill for the next 3 months and we'll study your bloods and all that. When you're dealing with some of the things that you were working on, like, studying dairy food intake and bone microarchitecture or the effect of a low sodium diet, some of the other work that you were doing in this period, this gets a lot more complex because it's a much broader matrix, let's say, especially when it comes to, if I'm giving somebody an elderberry extract, which is a mixture of many things, and you got to study the kinetics or whatever of what's happening there. How you make sure a patient stays on that low sodium diet or eats the proper amount of dairy foods or whatever that you're studying. Key learnings from that period of your postdoc in terms of conducting these types of studies that you took away.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I would first say that as a part of my doctoral degree, I really appreciate preclinical science. Um, I learned that mice will always show up to their appointments. They will
Yep.
never cancel anything on you, and there is a really unique ability to get at intricate processes um, and understand mechanism. That being said, I really missed that impact on humanity that I was craving. And so I thought, okay, I really need to diversify my skill set. I want to work more with humans and see what happens in real world scenarios rather than in caged mice. And so I decided to do a postdoc in nutritional epidemiology under Dr. Shivani Sani, where I went on with the complete opposite. I said, okay, let me look at um, large data sets about what people usually consume in a real world setting. They'll report what they eat, and then we can look at associations between really important outcomes that are critical for health and well-being of older adults. So I think honestly, learning that skill set was really pivotal for my career. Learning how to code and the pros and cons of certain data structures or cohort studies was really important for my career. And then I think scientifically, what I learned is that there does seem to be this um, pretty strong association between different diets or components of diets and physical well-being in older adults. So we study frailty, or we did, and um, if frailty is one of the geriatric conditions that
Sure.
is kind of like a physiological loss of reserve. And you can identify, there can be different types of frailty. There can be physical frailty. You can think of cognitive frailty. or even just the buildup of or the accumulation of various health deficits or conditions that can make a person more frail or predisposed to other things. And we found some really interesting work with um, not only on, a diet level of looking at, the Mediterranean diet and how that's protective against frailty development over time, but also with um, my key area of interest currently, flavonoids,
Yeah.
and how flavonoids might be protective against frailty.
Yeah. Let's dive a little further into that because I think it's a couple of really important things you're saying here because one this principle of frailty and when we talk a lot we've done a lot of shows on Geroscience and longevity over the last couple of years. And, well, a lot of that is focused on, this concept of how we delay age-related diseases or the basket of age-related morbidities. Frailty offers you, in this package, and you were just saying it can be physical frailty, mental frailty, and so forth. A different way. I know there's different terms for this, the aging syndromes, intrinsic capacity, a really interesting way to obviously study these interventions as opposed to waiting to see, 10 years to see if someone developed cancer or dementia, whatever. And then inflammation. And I think the hot term nowadays has been inflammaging and how, as you were just pointing out, inflammation is core behind a lot of how frailty progresses. What are some of the things I saw again a range of very interesting papers that you studied everything from carotenoids per the Mediterranean diet, flavonoids that they're very hot. You found an interesting connection that dairy food is actually not associated with. I think there's always been this fear that hey, we're eating too much dairy. Talk about this work if you would, and then if somebody does show up at a party and ask kind of how much dairy can I have? So, and things like that. What do you tell them nowadays? What you learned in this period?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think we're only as good as the work that we have in the literature. So, I want to be very honest with myself that although our work is important, it's not entirely conclusive. There's always going to be things that might change or things we didn't consider or think about because there's
Right.
always that potential for bias.
Yeah.
But when we see these consistencies across certain um, dietary patterns or foods that are known to affect inflammation, it's hard to argue against it. It's hard to
Yeah.
argue that inflammation is not, it's clear to me that inflammation is a key contributor of how diet can mediate different health effects. And I think um, one of our studies looked at a pro-inflammatory diet versus an anti-inflammatory diet,
Mm-hmm.
which um, it's essentially you create a score of um, how anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory someone is eating. So if you're eating a lot of things that the literature has shown decreases inflammation via reductions in inflammatory cytokines, and you eat a lot of that compound regularly, you are largely going to be kind of grouped in as someone who consumes an anti-inflammatory diet. And on the same token, you can be someone who's maybe consuming things that aren't so anti-inflammatory, but are more considered more pro-inflammatory based on what the literature says. And so I think that's like also that key point is like we're creating this score based off of what the research has said in the past. So we're hoping that all of that is true and that we have a full
Sure.
picture of everything. Um, but what we find is that, it's not necessarily that you have to consume only carotenoids every day. But if you consume uh, consume the same food or take a supplement that you can get it through the diet
Mm-hmm.
via a Mediterranean diet or via a more anti-inflammatory diet and see that it actually does reduce the risk of developing frailty.
Mm-hmm. Um, the continuing along that line, and then again, and this goes back to your dissertation, but I found it, again, amazing. I spent some time sort of learning more about lipid 654, but you studied this material, and it's related to a class of oral and gut microbes that are part of our microbiome. And we hear so much nowadays about the microbiome not just being these trillions of organisms that live within us, but be a really important component of the immune system. Here in this particular work, you showed all not just effects on atherosclerosis, but interesting models of hepatic injury, how this material plays around everywhere from impacting extracellular matrix gene expression, inflammatory cytokines, macrophage activation. All really important stuff, not just on the inflammatory side, but the immune system. And that's again another hot area in the sense of the immunosenescence and that whole area that happens later in life. Say a couple words about this as well, because I think the microbiome sits at this intersection between all these things. It's sort of modulating, too much inflammation and not enough inflammation, or not enough immune response. I'd love to just hear you talk a little about this, because it's very. I think we overlook the microbiome a little too much, and I think it's an extremely important piece that, hey, if we don't consider how it's part of this bigger picture, we don't get a complete picture of what's going on.
Absolutely. I think, like you said, the gut microbiome is a critical part of our host health and our health in general. And I think, it's really our first line of defense against, any pathogens or or toxins. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's really critical, I think, that we maintain a healthy gut. I don't think we exactly know what a healthy gut is yet. I
Yeah.
think as much as we overlook the microbiome in certain studies, there has been a lot of work on it. Um, but what we're learning is that there's so much variation within a person. And so your gut might look one way today and be a completely different profile tomorrow. And so that's a really complex environment, and it's really hard to understand what is happening in the gut and what effect it has.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that really interests me is just how much these microbes are doing. There
Right.
are so many pathways that and mechanisms that they are doing, from neurotransmitter production to fatty acid production, to even just preventing the being a physical barrier for those
Right.
pathogens to even get through to our immune system. I think they're kind of a jack of all trades, really. They do so much. And I guess that's another representation of molecular nutrition. Like, I
Right.
think about the molecular nutrition as being such a complex process because there are so many different um, components of the foods that we're eating, and kind of what's happening is synergistically, antagonistically within um, our bodies. And the same thing is happening within our gut,
Yeah.
and the interface between how the dietary compounds affect the gut. We know that fiber and prebiotics are really important for our gut health.
Right.
We know that there are actually changes that occur from flavonoids, and how they not only can, impact the actual gut health, but also and change the different microbes that are there, but they can also impact what processes they do
Mm-hmm.
within our body. And so I think it's a really, I think we're really starting to scratch the surface. And this is not my area of expertise, but we haven't even investigated the different or I personally haven't, but there's a ton of research that needs to be done on the different fungi
Right.
and other, microbes that are there that I'm only focused on bacteria, and there's this
Right.
whole other world that we're not even studying yet.
Yeah, yeah. I several months ago I had Craig Venter on the show, and we were talking about one of his papers in terms of the plasma virome, where they identified, I don't know how many thousands of viruses that are just swimming around in us, and it was like, well, what do they do? And he's like, I don't know. So we, we have a long way to go, but yeah, that's another area that's extremely exciting to me. But anyway, I'll come back to your work. Um, I'm gonna make a short tangent here, and then we'll come back to some of the bioactives. But this also, I guess, goes back to your postdoc work. Just a couple of months ago, Journal of the American Geriatric Society, you wrote this piece. It was entitled "Comparison of Targeted Web-Based Advertising versus Traditional Methods for Recruiting Older Adults into Clinical Trials." And I'm very interested in some of what you're learning on this front at the Marcus Institute. I mean, obviously, this is your population is quite discrete in the sense that you don't like near Barzilai and the folks at Einstein that are recruiting sort of the super centenarians. It's okay, it's kind of hard to find a lot of 110-year-old people, but in your particular case, you had a nice sort of basket there to recruit from. Challenges, and what are you learning in terms of how much an older adult that is somewhat web savvy is interested in participating in some of these clinical trials for these novel interventions?
Great question. I think implementation of science is just as important as the science that we are talking about and what the
Right.
results are. Um, a big part of my postdoc and even my current work is really to develop the skill set needed to conduct well-designed, rigorous trials in older adults.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I think across the board, what I've learned from my different studies that I've either led or helped on is that when we're doing clinical trials, recruitment is the hardest part. It really is something that it is quite challenging.
Yeah.
And for um, older adults, one strategy as we are gaining new technologies is to use on the online system to
Mm-hmm.
help advertise our study and recruit because traditional methods of going out, doing a research presentation of what your study does or giving someone a flyer, um, the uptake or the utility of those isn't as great as it could be. There's a lot of legwork that goes into that.
Right.
Um, and so now that there is this online capacity to kind of deliver targeted advertisements to individuals who seemingly might meet our inclusion criteria, it's a really efficient way to get our word out about our studies to try
Mm-hmm.
and recruit subjects.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, um, kind of the caveat of that is you risk recruiting um, a certain population or introducing selection bias into your sample.
Okay.
And so we want our study to be generalizable to whatever population we're studying. If we're studying older adults, we want it to, and that's our main included criteria, we want it to be relatively generalizable to older adults across the nation. If we're using this online platform and only delivering it to older adults who use the internet on a regular basis, we might be, you know, unexpectedly recruiting a population who might not be as generalizable to older adults. So
Mm-hmm.
what we really wanted to do in this study is we wanted to say, hey, let's actually look at a study or a few studies actually that implemented this online advertisement and compare those rates of recruitment methods to more traditional methods.
Right.
Not only do we want to compare like how efficient it was, but we also wanted to compare, well, are we actually getting different populations from what we were recruiting before, or are we getting similar individuals comparatively? And what we found is not only are we reaching more people with online advertising, we're also doing it at a faster rate, and we're recruiting individuals who are relatively similar in demographics and education level,
Mm-hmm.
age, as we were recruiting before. That's not to say everything's perfect. It's also possible that our non-traditional or our traditional methods were actually, kind of biased before, and that we, already recruit
Sure.
relatively healthy, well-educated older adults. But it was nice to see that they weren't starkly different. And I think that's
Right.
an important tool that we'll continue to implement throughout our studies.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, with that, um, let's move 1 month further because this paper just was published in the Lancet in February, and just the background here, we have discussed on several previous shows the concept of Senolytics. I before her passing, I had I was able to spend time with Judy Campisi, talking about the space, so our audience may be somewhat familiar with the principle of a senolytic compound and sort of the I guess the preeminent sort of repurposed combination that has been taken into the clinic so far is the combination of dasatinib, a very interesting sort of kinase inhibitor used for types of leukemia, and quercetin, a flavonoid or flavanol. Make sure I'm doing the right thing there. And the pilot study Senolytics to improve cognition and mobility in older adults at risk for Alzheimer's disease. Um, Take us into what you've done here, a little bit about the core learnings, because obviously Senolytics has been sort of at the forefront of these different classes of geroscience interventions. You've moved nicely into the clinic with this one on a very interesting indication. And then as a second part of that, and then I'll shut up and let you talk. Clearly, the plant kingdom, well, the microbial kingdom, fungal kingdom, is chock full of substances that may make for very good senolytics, maybe other of the xenomorphic substances, things that scavenge up SASP secretions and all that. Are you running into any interesting things as you study these different bioactives that might make for an interesting either add-on to D&Q or future clinical studies that you're excited about?
Oh, yeah, this is a topic that I'm quite interested in recently. So yeah, we have these old cells in the body that kind of wreak havoc and are thought to be related to age-related conditions. Some
Mm-hmm.
people call them zombie cells, which I really like. They're supposed to die, but they don't really die. And um, so what these senolytics do is they target the elimination of these cells, and the theoretical premise is that elimination or reduction of a portion of these cells might help with certain conditions of aging. And the work of Jim Kirkland and Tamara Chiconia, who are now at Cedars-Sinai, they've done an amazing amount of legwork on actually what are these compounds and how are they actually reducing these cells, and testing them rigorously in preclinical interventions. And one of those interventions looked at this combination of dasatinib and quercetin and in mice, and there were studies that show that in mice there were improvements in aspects related to mobility and cognition. And we decided as a group to translate that science from the clinic, or from the mice to the clinic. And there were a few studies that had been very small, first time in human studies, to say, okay, is this safe? And that I think is right now our goal is to demonstrate safety of these um, compounds in humans because it is so novel and we really don't know. And so that was the goal of the stamina study. And
Mhm.
so we took a population, or we recruited for a population of older adults with mild cognitive impairment and slow gait speed. So, it's kind of deficits in motor and cognitive function who are particularly vulnerable to the development of Alzheimer's disease. The idea being that if we can catch that early and give these senolytics and reduce those cells, that we might be able to prevent development of those more progressive, severe impairments. And so we conducted a very small study that was regulated by the FDA.
Mhm.
And I think it was only the fourth study that has actually done a senolytic intervention in humans. And we found that not only were people incredibly compliant, but the study was relatively safe.
Right.
Uh, we had no severe adverse events that were related to the intervention, and relatively minor, commonly reported adverse events among the aging community. So it's unclear if it's an adverse event that might be related to just aging in general. We only had six, I think, that were that were possibly related to our intervention. So I think we did demonstrated sufficient safety in that study and added to the literature that these compounds do appear safe
Mhm.
in the populations that we've studied thus far. And what I found really interesting is that despite our small sample size, we did see a um, relatively significant and strong association between levels of inflammation and changes in cognition. So we
Okay.
had a group of individuals who, over the course of this intervention, decreased levels of inflammation, and those decreases of inflammation were associated with increases in cognitive scores,
Mm.
suggesting that there is this link between these compounds, inflammation, and cognitive improvement.
Mhm.
Um, However, I think I would just say that this was a very small study. There's a lot more work to be done, and we can't unequivocally say that this is a true effect. But planning future studies would be is our next step, and I think it's a really exciting area if it
Mhm.
turns out to be fruitful.
No, absolutely, and even though it's still you're learning so much, not just from what the combination can do, but again the ultimately how you structure the next ones,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's right. I mean, so yeah, and I applaud you for this, and again, it's nice to see having heard about Senolytics, and the Senolytic story or senescent cell story for many years now to see this properly structured work going on. I'll say properly, because we don't we don't often see proper clinical models like this in the space. So I'm excited to see this happening, and glad that you're championing this. So that's great. Um, and then speaking about combinations, and I would personally, because I haven't slept in years. um, I would love to could go into a current study that you're recruiting for now, and then there's a link on the website, and we'll glad to link to it in the show notes. But this is on your study on tart cherries and sleep. Um, I did not know. I did a little research based on your material that the tart cherries are full of not just melatonin but magnesium, which is really important for relaxation, other bioactive compounds, no doubt, that may help with sleep. This study will be going on for a couple, 3 months, I believe. There's going to be a digital component, a lot of blood and urine sampling. If this is confidential, you don't tell, but there's a placebo juice. I guess that you can't use I guess you can't use cranberries or pomegranate or something like that because they may be equally or they might have other benefits. So if you could talk about the placebo, that'd be cool. But if not, don't worry about it. Talk about this study. I think it's really cool, and I would love to be involved in it. But I think I'm not 65 yet. Damn.
Yeah, so this is a study I'm quite interested in. A lot of my work focused on physical health, but I'm really interested in brain health and brain
So,
health. Um, there are different domains between mood and sleep and cognition, and I think they're all intricately related. But this study is particularly focused on sleep. I don't know. Um, I just I love to sleep, and
me
maybe I'm
too.
biased in this. But yeah, it's one of my favorite things in the world, and unfortunately, a lot of older adults suffer from poor sleep. And the pharmacological treatments that are available either come with really severe side effects or can be addictive. And so I think really is a need to kind of go back to our roots, no pun intended, and see what we can leverage from the diet from a molecular level to target pathways relevant to sleep. So this is a small pilot study that I'm running. There were two studies in older adults that have previously looked at um, tart cherry juice consumption and in sleep in older adults who report some level of mild insomnia. And some things we really didn't know was how long the study needed to go on for to see a benefit. There was a hint that that tart cherry juice actually improved sleep quantity, so like how much you sleep, but it wasn't improving sleep quality, self-reported
Mm,
satisfaction. So was it that we weren't just looking at how long the study was? If the treatment duration wasn't long enough, we might be missing that impact on sleep quality.
hmm
And I think what I wanted to do was do a real comprehensive evaluation of the mechanism. So, yeah, you mentioned melatonin, that there is a natural amount of melatonin in tart cherry juice that might be helpful for sleep. But the amount of melatonin in tart cherry juice is nowhere near the levels that some people are taking as supplements, and that supplemental um, studies have shown is effective for improving sleep. So that really led me to believe, oh, it's this interaction between all these different factors. And so
hmm
one of the studies looked at, the flavonoids and how that might impact in inflammation. But I think there's also this relationship that could be with the amount of magnesium that's in tart cherry juice. So there's some
hmm
magnesium that is related to cortisol and stress. So I really wanted to cast a wide net and look at all the different pathways. So that's what we're doing right now. So yeah, we're recruiting for older adults who self-report mild insomnia and are willing to consume tart cherry juice or placebo for 4 weeks.
hmm
And we'll look at sleep quality, sleep quantity, and all these different biomarkers that might help us understand the mechanism.
hmm
You brought up a really important point that is a common struggle of mine is designing interventions and designing an appropriate placebo. And so
Yeah.
um, historically, what has been done in those studies is they'll do a cherry flavored cordial
Ooh.
or juice that is similar in calorie, but you're right. I can't use pomegranate juice because there would be bioactives in there.
Right.
So we fortunately, the I personally think the best placebo is an artificially flavored juice, although that does come with its challenges.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's again, it's not something you won't be able to figure out, but again, it shows the complexity and the extra. things that you have to think about when designing
Yeah.
these studies. And again, I'm sure you'll come up with an elegant approach, as you have with most of these studies. Um, Courtney, what else is going on with your team that we should know about? I mean, we have the cherry study, finished up the Senolytics, and you get the blueberries and the microbiome. Anything else I missed while we have you today that you want to mention, please?
Hmm. Um, I guess one one thing that I would love to promote is, although that I'm doing this deep dive into these foods and nutrients or compounds that might impact emotional well-being or brain health or physical health, I think at the same time, it's really important to be realistic.
Right.
And I I am such a big proponent of moderation is key. I don't subscribe to a particular diet or a particular um, compound that I need to take as a supplement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there are ways to utilize diet to help with the um, conditions or ailments or inflammation that we might be having. Um, but I don't want to suggest we need to overcorrect and completely eliminate things like a piece of chocolate cake,
Mm.
because I think a piece of chocolate cake at the end of the day can be really satisfactory for someone. And hey, there are cocoa flavonoids that are in there that might be offsetting some of the um, less ideal health effects. And so I think it, as important as I think it is to understand the molecular mechanisms of how this work and how we can utilize to promote health through our diet and food, I just also want to, understand that we shouldn't demonize any foods, I guess
Oh
I
yeah,
would say.
yeah. Piece of chocolate cake make me very happy, and yeah, I mean that's yeah. And we forget about that part of food. So no, I appreciate
Yeah, I mean,
that
so
it's a
true. Like, I think,
yeah,
yeah, I think that it's sometimes in abstaining from a food and being like, oh, I really want that chocolate cake, but I can't have it, can be more detrimental than just eating the dang piece of cake.
exactly, exactly. And no disrespect to all the calorie restriction people out there, but if that turns out to be the solution for all this stuff, forget about it. Don't, forget
Well,
about it.
that is true. There are some very interesting studies on calorie restricted diets and the different types of geroscience and cellular senescence. That is very cool
Yeah,
work.
yeah. Courtney, before I let you go today, what's coming up for 2025 in terms of your sort of conference circuit? Any things that we should know about there, talks you're going to be giving, other public facing initiatives? Anything else you want to say while we have you on the show today?
I will be at the nutrition conference in Orlando this year, at the end of May, early June.
Okay.
Um, I'm always looking for collaborations. So,
Mhm.
um, I love a cold email, and I think working together and interdisciplinary nature is the best way to make really good science. So, yeah, don't hesitate to reach out or find me at a conference.
Awesome. Awesome. And we'll put the link to your specific website at the Marcus Institute, and people can find you there. So again, really, really awesome work. I love this topic and I love everything you're doing. So I applaud you and wish you and the team the best with it as you continue to move these programs forward. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode across the various podcasts, or who's going to be watching it on the YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Dr. Courtney Millar, assistant scientist, Hendon Arthur Marcus Institute for Aging Research, Hebrew Senior Life, instructor of medicine, Harvard Medical School, and Beth Israel, Deaconess Medical Center. Courtney, again, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while about all these cool topics. Thank you for everything you do for health, wellness, and aging. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for many people out there via the research you're conducting. Awesome story, and wishing you the best with it.
Thank you so much.
Great having you.